Recently watched one of two movies, Nosferatu or The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Another one to add to your list would be Metropolis, a Fritz Lang film. I show you these films because they're very directly related to what we're doing in design, but also because they're great films in their own right, and they sort of chronicle a time in history that's both political, social, and a great time where art was sort of primary position to have social effects, and we're still looking at that art form today in a lot of things that surround us. So Metropolis, Fritz Lang film, was one of the big films that you could go look at. Wasn't part of the assignment, but an excellent film, and it's the first film where you see an actual robot, a humanoid type of robot in it. Which is quite significant. 100 years ago, these movies were made during a time of you know during a period of sort of great turmoil in Eastern Europe and in Germany in particular. We're going into World War One, throughout World War One, and entering World War Two. Throughout this period of German Expressionism, so there's something in the air, and these movies really pick up on a lot of that, the war effort and so on. But they are still interesting movies, and some of the first amazing science fiction and horror movies to be created. So Metropolis has this robot, a very famous robot. I'm sure, undoubtedly, you've seen it elsewhere. And these types of factories in this society that's just basically humans are just workers and robots, and really don't, very much like robots themselves. Very relevant theme even today, of course. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is more psychological, and in terms of German Expressionism, it's been sort of looked at as the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari sort of looks at interior oriented German Expressionism, and it focuses on these big angular interiors and the sort of dramatic shadows, and perspective is twisted and tilted, and it does symbolize a lot of what's going on in the world. The world is falling apart, and sort of the craziness of the psychology of this film, and the world is reflected in the architecture and the angular lines that are both used in the film and in German Expressionist painting as well. These films are still, really great effect, and in pop culture you will see examples of how they've been referenced over and over again. And you can see here the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, the professor is in this hallway, and it's just a bleak sort of situation, and everything is kind of collapsing in around him, and that's very much a feature of German Expressionist art. As walking up over the buildings, the windows are angular. Nothing is lined up in correct perspective. Everything is off, and everything is somewhat twisted. And that extends to the human forms as well in these films. Nosferatu, the first vampire ever to show up on film, and this is another significant film. But the use of shadows and backdrops in this film, they're natural backdrops, but they are taken directly from German classical painting. And sort of what happens in German Expressionism is they take the natural landscape and they turn it on its head, basically, with intense colors, and it becomes very unnatural. And in German Expressionism, everything is kind of wrong, everything is off somewhat, and they show that in the design aspects of it rather than just in the subject matter, like on the surface. Everybody's familiar with this image of Nosferatu, and he's been done over and over again. You've seen him in The Simpsons, you've seen him in SpongeBob as a late night manager. It's something that we're very familiar with, even though most of us have never looked back on these films or at this period. The use of the shadow is doing something different from the character. That creeping shadow is a huge symbol, throughout. I mean, cast shadows from Renaissance artwork right up through German Expressionism to the way we use them today. They're all this very important way to express something in artwork or designs or in films. That's a Tim Burton use of the shadow. And you can see how it's so directly related to Nosferatu. Tim Burton was extremely German Expressionist influence. Most of his films have elements of German Expressionism to them. Edward Scissorhands, very much similar, if not identical, to the character in Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. This robot, again, has made such an impact over the years. We look at C3PO, and we can see that there's definitely a resemblance, if not, again, a direct link between the two. So even though these movies are very old and some of this imagery is very old, it's still distinctly of the world that we live in today. So don't hesitate to look back on these historical time periods because they have a relevance to what you're doing now. So when we get into German Expressionist art, we look at sort of Germany transitioning from one art period to another. So if you were an art student in school at those times, and this is Max Beckmann, you would be looking at kind of the newest art you would be looking at probably would be like Impressionist art and the kind of the light, colorful plein air art that's being done in France and throughout Europe at the time, in northern Italy and so on. So these soft colors and nice flesh tones and those sort of things were indicative of that. It was basically, as the world crept forward into the First World War, that ideal sort of situation didn't fit anymore. And so the artists started to become, the colors shifted, and the way we look at paint as, and marks and colors that we got here as the way to tell the story. Well, the way they would tell the story or create their designs in the more expressionist style would be to take all of these elements and distort them or use them differently than they used in this type of painting. This is the same artist after he had developed his expressionist style, and you can see here now the colors aren't pink and soft and happy. They're a little bit brooding. They're somewhat classical, but even like the situation of the architecture, everything's getting a little bit bent and a little bit distorted. And distortion is a very big part of what happens in German expressionist painting. Another Max Beckmann painting. And what's happening is the war is going on, and there's starting to be this sort of focus upon, rounding up Jews, and prison camps are starting to be developed. And then people know this is happening, but they're not comfortable, or they're not quite sure, and they don't know how to comment on it. Artists can't openly criticize the government, so what they do is they create metaphors or these different ways of telling the story that looks somewhat innocent. Like, this could be anything. This could be a doctor's office where they're looking at people. What the cues are in here is that the human forms are not naturalistic. They are bent and they're distorted. They're sort of hinting at broken limbs and close claustrophobic situations and so on. So a very, very different way of telling the stories. They've gone from bright and happy to these much more brooding, much more intense things. And this is where color really comes in and starts, having much more meaning in terms of telling the story, being relied on for that. Okay. Another Max Beckmann. Sometimes they would take biblical stories or historic stories and repaint them, but they were doing it in a way to sort of reference that this is what's happening now, even though this might be a story from 1,000 years ago. We're kind of referencing here and now. One of the things Max Beckmann did was did his works in triptychs, and triptychs are associated with church paintings, altar paintings. So in a traditional triptych, it would be around the altar of a church, and you would have a painting on either side of the altar, and then one either over above or in behind the altar, and they would all work together to tell a single story, or they would have a relationship from one to another. But in Beckmann's case, he would take old stories about people that were being oppressed or being forced to flee their countries from biblical stories, but the implications would be that that's what's happening now in Germany. So it was somewhat of a secret code. Space got flat and distorted. Again, the colors just become unnatural and uncomfortable. They're meant not to make you feel happy and calm. They are meant to be intense and sort of wake you up. It's the distortion of the world around you. Nothing is straight up and down. Nothing is really right at the moment. It's not that everything is really, from this picture you can see, it's not that everything is totally different than it was, but there's distortions that are happening. Some things, rules that have existed, for example, the rules of perspective, aren't holding up anymore, and that's essentially what they're talking about, metaphorically. and I can't remember the name of this artist offhand, but we'll get Kirchner, Ludwig Kirchner. Again, another German Expressionist artist. And these guys all have very colorful backstories as well. But again, you see the flattening of the picture plane and just this weirdness between the juxtaposition of this sort of uniformed figure with limbs missing and then this naked figure in behind. And again, there's references to the war and to the, the atrocities of the war and the prison camps again. Again, even, these colorful portraits, they're so bright, they're so vivid that they're just wrong, on so many levels, but they are meant to be like really like clashing and intense to make you uncomfortable. Always weird viewpoints. And if you think of Nosferatu, then you think about when you're looking up at Nosferatu or down on the ship, and you're always looking at these really odd, wide vantage points, like across the landscape in German Expressionist landscape and traditional German landscape as well. But you can see that throughout Nosferatu. Again, these landscapes, they go from being naturalistic to being intensely colored and not natural colors and very jarring, much brighter than you would ever see, and really clashing types of colors. Again, to make you uncomfortable and to suggest that the world isn't right. The interesting thing is that during this period, the Nazis started to look at the German Expressionist work, and it upset, in particular, Adolf Hitler quite a bit. Adolf Hitler had been an art student, and he was of the more traditional lineage of art students. So this new work of art was something that he rejected very strongly, and literally came out publicly against. At some point, the way to turn people against this art form, because people were liking this art form because it was vivid and it was interesting and it was exciting and it was new, to turn people against it, the Nazi Party labeled this artwork as having been done by insane people and crazy people and degenerates. And in fact, they hosted a huge exhibition called the Degenerate Art Exhibition, and they put all this work on the walls. They hung it all crooked, and they spray painted words, degenerates and things on the walls, trying to defame these artists and put them down. But it was such an exciting exhibition that people just wanted to see it, so they became more and more popular. The irony of all this is that while the Nazis, Adolf Hitler and his generals, were publicly condemning this type of artwork, they were privately collecting it because they knew it to be valuable, and they knew it someday they were going to be rich off of this artwork. And of course, generals wanted to be seen as sophisticated and intelligent, so they embraced this new work privately, but publicly they came out against it, much like what we see happening in the contemporary world. Again, just vivid and angular. Even look at the brushstrokes. They're not, when we look at wanting to create a nice, harmonious, calm composition, we calm down some of that texture in those brushstrokes. And the nature of a German Expressionist work is these violent brushstrokes that have this energy, and it's almost like they've laid down that brushstroke and rushed on to the next one, because there's this sense of pressure and speed in these that disappears when you do something different with those brushstrokes. So the way you make the mark in your designs is, says something about, not only says something about the work and about how you handle materials, but it actually will affect the pace or the speed of the canvas and the feel of the canvas. So, and that's why, texture is a very important element when you're wanting to manipulate principles of design. Katie Kolowitz was a printmaker for the most part and a drawer, and while she wasn't openly criticizing the war effort, she was more about criticizing the working conditions for people in the coal mines and some of the situations where people would be basically working under slave labor conditions. And so that was her theme. And again, she used a dark black and white contrast to sort of emphasize this. And then through the wood block prints, those jagged sort of lines, in terms you have to carve this into a block of wood, then put ink on the wood and print it to create the design. So she took advantage of that edgy, hard, rough surface to add into how she handled her subject matter. Not a lot of happy art during the German Expressionist period. A lot of it is claustrophobic. A lot of it will have multiple figures crushed into a very small pictorial space. This artist, this Franz Marc, was one of the infamous artists that Hitler hated. This particular painting was a painting that Hitler painted because this yellow cow was so unnatural. Hitler's remarks were, "How could a cow be yellow?" And it's a happy cow also. It's smiling. And how could animals be smiling? Because this was directly in the face of the sort of ideas of the Aryan race, and that the humans are above all creatures, that animals can't have human qualities and so on. So it kind of, all of Franz Marc's critters essentially had these sort of human qualities to them, and that was an insult to sort of the past and the past views of man being above all things in nature. Again, directly related to Cubism, but also a big part of German Expressionism, is the flattening of these picture planes. And so you see these angular shapes rather than a full rounded figure. And that really kind of like, it does a couple of things. It makes the canvas flatter. So what happens is you don't have true depth in most of these. You don't have the illusion of deep space. What you have is a shallow space that sort of pushes and pulls, like the canvas, like the surface of the painting is made of plastic or something, and it doesn't quite break through to the illusion of some sort of deep space or realism. And it's a very conscious decision on the part of the artist and the art form. Okay. Very flat. So you don't think of this as, you're not looking for the sky in the background as looking like the real sky. What you're looking at is the overall flow of the design, the distribution of the elements through the design. So this approach to painting focuses you on the flatness of the surface and on the compositional elements, and so it doesn't do the same thing that you would be getting from a Renaissance piece that's trying to make you think of infinite space going off into the heavens. Lots of movement, lots of energy. Always movement and energy in almost every German Expressionist piece you're going to find. Showed you, this is the artist's last name is Gross. But this is, a lot of times, again, when they're first trained, they're trained by traditional painting professors, we'll say, in the academy. So they're trained to paint in the old ways. And as they all learn how to paint in the old ways. So their early self-portraits are in the old-fashioned style, but they quickly realize that the old ways don't fit how you need to approach something like painting in the new times. And so they almost all dramatically shift very rapidly. And that's a little bit later. Okay, the striving for realism sort of disappears, and they're trying to get something different, something more than realism, because realism, for the most part, can be taught. And so if they just stick to traditional approaches to picture making, essentially, they can make something look incredibly realistic, and they can make the space look infinitely deep. But it's really following just a system of how you lay down your lines and colors. Going into German Expressionism, the rules are new. There's a lot of this, a lot of space for experimentation and adaptation and for trying new things, and so artists are attracted to that. Very critical of the Nazi machine. Again, still pretty beautiful colors and forms, but just a little bit off, sort of the paleness of the skin, the weird angular sort of nature of the pose in this flat space. They're very beautiful, but they maybe take some time to kind of get comfortable with. Not all art is instantly accessible. Some art you look at and you will love instantly. Some art you might hate it at first, but you'll go back and look at it after several times. It'll start drawing you in, and then once you start really liking it, you can't get enough of it. Everything's a little bit off. In this one, the architecture seems to be the only thing that's holding up pretty well, but the characters are a little bit distorted. Oh, this is Edvard Munch. And of course, most of us know Edvard Munch for the painting the Scream. This one looks like it's been cropped a little bit. And again, the Scream was a little earlier than a lot of that, early in the terms of German Expressionism, but you can see how what it took the emotion of this sort of character on the bridge where there's sort of this feeling of paranoia and being threatened, where it goes into this swoon, and the color and the shape of the direction of the composition around it accentuates that feeling of the swoon. You know, even those characters that are in the back up on the left-hand corner become threatening, but yet they're really just two barely described features. But the way the rails of the the sidewalk or whatever you want to call that project back up to that corner, it sort of creates this sort of focus on them, and they come at the figure in the foreground. So it's just using very simple tools to really create this strong psychological effect. Now, Munch didn't just do the Scream; he did a range of other things, but oftentimes his characters had this sort of feeling, these looks in their faces like they had seen too much. So there's always still, again, this idea of the war and how the effects it's having on the people. And at the time that, you know, things weren't great in Germany leading up to World War One as well. So there was a lot of poverty, and so there's a lot. The work reflects a lot of that sort of added attitude. The attitude would be referred to as zeitgeist, and zeitgeist is referred to as spirit of the time. And that's sort of, we would have the zeitgeist of 2022 might be affected by the pandemic and those things that sort of create the atmosphere that we live within. Munch's Madonna, scandalous, of course, because she was naked. More wide-eyed characters. And the painting style isn't as jarring and abrupt as some of the others with big slashing strokes, but the colors are brooding, and the characters tend to be washy and not very developed, sort of half there but not there. Vasily Kandinsky, Russian-born expressionist, who moved later to the U.S. What he wanted to do is so his painting is a little different. I thought I'd show you some stuff that's a little on the happier note. He was trying to paint sound in his work, and so it's a little bit of an offshoot, but he had a lot of many of the same characteristics of German Expressionist painting, trying to give sort of a visual form to something that is not a visual in its own right. And these are all, for the most part, dealing with sounds and music and opera and symphony and things like that. So, of your elements and principles of design, you can take all of your elements and they can all be used, for example, here, like line is suggesting music, you can almost see strings of an instrument in there, but even the way the lines kind of wobble and wave, it sort of suggests this sort of sound wave. And, the colors, the way they're just sort of intermittently spaced, create sort of a tempo and a pattern and so on. So you really think about your elements and principles of design and how much you can do with them. For the most part, up to now, we've just been looking at how to lay out colors and forms so we can create some sort of depth of space and see how the shapes and colors work together. But once we start seeing that, then we want to do something with what we've learned. And after looking at the German Expressionist work, I'm hoping that you can really add this into some of the upcoming designs. And that's it. Now there are hundreds, maybe thousands more German Expressionist paintings that you can look at. I've given you a sampling of about 5 or 6 artists. If you want to see more German Expressionist artists, you can go to Google Arts and Culture, or you can just Google German Expressionist paintings or German Expressionist artists, and you can come up with dozens of more examples. So, the goal for you is to understand how other artists approach art, not necessarily to mimic them, but to learn how to think about art and design in a way that you can kind of approach it more creatively. But it's really going to help for you to look at more art, look at more design, because you're going to see many people's takes on the same subject. All right, that's it.